This video will be my full and final review of the Niner RIP 27.5. This is a demo that I've had for a little over 4 months. Due to the COVID situation, I was able to hold on to this demo a little bit longer than I normally would, so thank you, Niner, for letting me do that. I've made other videos on this bike, and I've covered some other things in more detail. This video will be the full review. That'll be a little bit more high level, so let's get into it. This bike is not a 29er with 27.5 wheels thrown into it. This is a bike that Niner have optimized for 27.5 wheels. The first thing that I want to mention about the frame is the stiffness. Niner have really done a great job on this bike to increase the stiffness. That includes these little struts here that go across the shock. And I mentioned before in some of my videos that you do have to use a little adapter that Niner does include with the bike. The good thing is you really only have to use it 1 or 2 times when you're setting up the suspension. After that, it's really a moot point. But the stiffness that you get from these struts, to me, is well worth it. So that's one of the things that makes this bike so fun to ride, so playful, is how stiff it is. Throwing it from corner to corner, going through technical terrain, the bike does not move around, does not wallow around. It really holds its lines well. So kudos to Niner for making a frame that's really optimized to be a playful, stiff frame. This bike comes with the ability to change the geometry, and I made a video on how to do that. I'll link that in the description below. But I ended up running it mainly in the low setting. It was in the high setting when I got it. It was good for my cross-country type trails, but I quickly put it into the low setting and I would keep it there. I mean, the fact that this is a 27.5, you already get more agility. So I think keeping it in the low setting is going to be what most riders are going to want to do. And when you do that, the head angle goes from 66 down to 65. You also drop the bottom bracket by 7 millimeters. So you really just make the bike more capable on rougher terrain by putting it in the low setting. I do consider the flip chip something that you would not want to do frequently. It's more so you can set up the bike to your liking, or if you ride more cross-country type trails and you've got a trip coming up where you want to make the bike a little bit more downhill focused, you can put it in the low setting. But again, it's not something you're going to want to do every ride. It's just to set up the bike to your liking for your riding style and for your terrain. While I'm mentioning the pivot bolts, I'll say that the only maintenance issue I've had with this bike when it was in my possession is the fact that the pivot bolt was really tight when I went to flip the chip. Since this is a demo, I think the person who had the bike before me over-tightened that, and it actually caused an issue with the bearing. So I think the left bearing was a little bit messed up. I mean, it's only 15 Newton meters, which is not that tight. And it was, I'd say it probably took me 50 to 60 Newton meters to undo that bolt. Now, I did have some Loctite on it, but I don't think the Loctite made it that tight. I think it was over tightened, and again, it caused a little bit of an issue with the bearing. But other than that, the bike has been pretty much just maintenance free the whole time I've had it. Cable routing on this bike is about as clean and easy to work on as it gets. So everything goes into the head tube, and of course the dropper post cable stays inside. You get your brake cable that comes out here and goes back inside the seat stay and then pops out right here. Likewise, the rear derailleur cable goes inside the seat stay and then comes out down by the shifter. Now, what's nice about this, and you know, for those of you who build your own bikes, you'll really appreciate this, is you just feed the cable up in one side and then it goes along the frame and then just pops out the other. It is, like I said, probably some of the easiest cable routing that I've ever used. Now, this bike is the 4-star XT build, and I'm not going to go too much into the build of this bike since it does come with various builds, but in my opinion, this is the best build for the money, and if I were to ever buy this bike to be my own, this is definitely the build that I would get. I've been really impressed with these DT Swiss 1900 wheels. Normally, I'm pretty quick to want to put on some carbon wheels on a bike, but these DT Swiss wheels have been really easy to work with, but the ride quality on these really impresses me. I actually have another set of these, the 29er version, on the Jet 9, which is my personal bike, and again, I've been really impressed with these wheels. I really like the fact that Niner puts a 36 millimeter stanchion fork on this bike. It really shows what category Niner is gearing this bike to be, and that is going to be, I would say, you know, all mountain. All mountain to me is kind of between trail and full-blown enduro. So this is a bike that really can handle some pretty tough terrain. So let's go ahead and talk about the ride quality of this bike. So locally, I liked riding this bike on my cross-country trails, but when I got it up into the mountains, that's when the bike just really shined. You know, locally, and I'll talk about this when I talk about my conclusion of 27.5 versus 29, really comparing this bike to the Jet 9. But locally, I actually preferred the 29er a little bit just because of how confident it was throwing the bike hard into a corner. But when I got up into the mountains, what I really appreciated about this bike was how maneuverable and how manageable it was. So I'm a 29er fan, but jumping back on this bike, it made me just realize what I also love about 27.5. So when you're going up a climb, like I said, this bike just feels manageable. It feels like you can get around, you know, a rock or a root really easily. And my favorite thing about this bike is how it feels lower to the ground, but yet you've still got 150 millimeters of travel up front and 140 in the rear. That's a really good amount of travel. Also, being a 27.5, the stack at the head tube is typically less than what you have on a 29, and that really helps it have that manageable feel. So I'm not really tall, so I'm 5'8", a little bit more, and I feel perfectly proportioned on this bike. I feel like this is a bike that I'm really in control of. With the 29er, you kind of make the bike do a little bit more of the work, whereas on this bike, with it being a 27.5 and having a stiffer frame, you really just feel like you're able to control and maneuver the bike a little bit better. The only real downside I can say about this bike is I do get more pedal strikes. And that's because the bottom bracket is pretty low in the low setting, but also the crank arms are 175, and also it being a 27.5 versus a 29, the bottom bracket just sits a little bit lower. So it's just something you have to be aware of. It's really a trade-off because a low bottom bracket gets your center of gravity low, which makes the bike just feel incredible on a descent. But you do have to be aware of it. And where I found that to be the most problematic is going up a climb and there's a big root, you know, like a 4 or 5 inch root that you got to time your pedal stroke just perfectly to get over it without hitting the pedals. If I were to get this bike, I would probably try to get a set of 170 cranks on this bike. I think the small comes with 170s, but medium and up comes with 175. So I said I wasn't really going to go into the components, but I just want to mention a few highlights. First of all, shifting with this XT has been flawless. I know that SRAM just came out with a 52 rear cassette, but the one on this one, which is I think it's a 51, if it's not, I'll correct it in the video there, but I have not needed a smaller gear than this. So again, shifting has been flawless, braking has been just, you know, it's flawless as well. I've had issues with SRAM every once in a while with stuck pistons. I've had it on a mountain bike and I had it on a road bike, or it's actually a cyclocross bike. But the braking on this is really smooth. You get more initial bite with Shimano XT. I do think SRAM you get a little bit better modulation, but the initial bite on the SRAM XT is great. You get plenty of power. The only downside about XT, and you know, I don't know if this is because of the mineral fluid. I like using mineral oil versus DOT because you don't have to be quite as cautious with it. But Shimano does use these cooling fins, and probably because mineral oil can heat up a little bit more than DOT fluid. Again, I don't know that for sure, but these will rattle around a little bit and they're a little bit noisy when you're on the trail. It's something that you get used to. In fact, when we were riding the mountains, I really didn't even notice it. On the first couple rides I did, but I've got these same brakes on my Jet 9, and you know, like I said, it's not that big of a deal, but just something to be aware of. Another component that I want to draw attention to is the KS left seat post. It is absolutely the smoothest dropper post that I've used in a long time. No issues with it. Again, just super smooth. Also, the saddle is very comfortable. I don't like Niner saddles on gravel bikes for rides more than about 3 or 4 hours, but I did a 4-hour ride on this, and you know, on a mountain bike, you're not in the saddle as much as you are like on a gravel ride. And so this Niner saddle has been really comfortable. I like the little anatomical cutout there. So no complaints with the saddle on this bike. Another just spot on spec of this bike is the tire choice. So on the front, you've got a Minion DHF 2.5 and then an Aggressor 2.5 in the rear. And these tires, again, that's a perfect spec for this bike. These tires have pretty low rolling resistance. Like I never felt, even on pavement, that the tires were dragging. And of course, you've got just tons of traction on the downhills. I mean, coming downhill on this bike, I had a blast. I kind of liken 27.5 to a really fast turning slalom ski. So I did a lot of skiing back in the day, and when I was skiing, I wanted a ski that was really fast turning. I didn't care about it being super fast on the downhill, going straight. I wanted that playfulness. I wanted to just turn quickly, and that's the way I think of a 27.5. It's like that really fast turning ski that may not be quite as fast as a 29 if you're just going straight down the mountain, but this bike is super playful. I mentioned this about the RIP 929 version of this bike that I had for quite a while, and that is I love the sag meter on this. It makes setting up your suspension absolutely a no-brainer. So all you do is you set your air pressure a little bit high and then just keep letting a little bit out until you get to the 30% mark. It is easier to have someone next to you looking at it, but you can look down and see it. But it's the sag meter. I wish every bike that I use has this because, again, it just makes setting up that suspension so easy. Let's talk about Niner CVA suspension, which I've mentioned before is one of my favorite suspension designs because of how good this bike feels when you're pedaling. So when you're cranking hard up a climb, you really get just almost direct power transfer to the pedals. And then when you stop pedaling, so when you're going downhill or just cruising, the bike just really opens up, the suspension opens up. And even when you're cranking hard and you hit a rock or a root, it will kind of, allow the rear tire to conform. You don't get that pedal kickback that you get from some other suspension designs. So again, it's probably one of my favorite suspension designs. This bike pedals beautifully. Another really sweet spec of this bike is the Fox Dpx To Shock. It's probably one of my favorite shocks. It's not quite as tunable as the X2 that I have on my new Transition Sentinel, but this one is easier to set up. So you've got compression damping with a small 3mm Allen key. Of course, your rebound on the other side over here. And so it's just a great feeling shock. I will mention that the fork does have high and low speed compression and high and low speed rebound damping. So the fork is very tunable. So that'll wrap up this complete review of the Niner 27.5. This bike to me is a perfect example of why I hope the bike industry never goes away from 27.5 wheels. Just like I said in one of my opening videos of this bike, I think this is the perfect travel range for 27.5. Cross country, less travel, I would want 29. Full on enduro where you're just going over rough, rugged terrain as fast as you can possibly go. Personally, I would choose 29. But that middle ground of travel range where speed is not necessarily your main priority, just getting out and riding, having fun, having a bike that feels manageable, that you can move around, is a perfect reason why 27.5 wheels exist. And really kudos to companies like Niner, like Transition that have just completely redesigned the Scout. Thank you guys for keeping 27.5 wheels alive, because even as I'm like talking about this bike and reviewing it, I'm just thinking like I'm probably gonna have another 27.5 in my fleet that I own. Currently I don't, but man, this bike, Niner made a winner with this bike. Like I said before, the stiffness of the frame is kind of just what brings this bike all together. As always, questions or comments that you have, drop those below. How about you? Have you been on 29 for a while and demoed or bought a 27.5? Leave in the comments below your thoughts of how you felt after getting back on a 27.5. I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.